Journalist and writer A'Eysha Kassiem recently released her highly anticipated debut novel titled Suitcase of Memory. This read is told from a first-person perspective where the protagonist, Bastian Bredenkamp, narrates his twofold story of how he died and also weaves together the extraordinary tale of how he lived his life. This book that took A'Eysha about 15 years to put together taps into themes such as Muslim identity, race, land, classicism, history, amongst many others. And to tell us more about this multi-layered of offering is writer A'Eysha Kassiem. A'Eysha, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Simpiwe. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm delighted to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure having you, A'Eysha. Let's start with you giving us a brief outline of what this book is all about and what inspired it.
Right. So Bastian Bredenkamp is the narrator in Suitcase of Memory, and he's dead. So the reader knows from the beginning that he's dead. And Bastian tells the extraordinary tale of his life and his death. And in the book, the two parts are woven together. They're two stories in one, where Bastian's life and his death run parallel to each other. But the book really explores very strong themes around identity. You know, identity is not just the kinds of moments we create every day. Identity is also something that we inherit from our ancestors, from the generations who came before. And so Suitcase of Memory is a book that looks at identity from different perspectives and really tries to make sense of what that means to the various characters in this book, who are all from very different backgrounds.
All right, now speak to us about the title of the book and how it explores the gift of memory that the narrator and protagonist Bastian Bredenkamp has.
Right. So Suitcase of Memory is also a literal suitcase in the book. So there is an actual suitcase in the book, but it also represents the various things that we carry around with us, you know, the various perceptions that we inherit from others. And we all have these things, you know, in terms of how we view one another, in terms of how we interpret our past, and also our place in that past and our place in society today. You know, for me, the past and the present and the future are really all very much interrelated. You know, it's very difficult for us to say, oh, you know, the past is something that happened 27 years ago, you know, and yet today, here we are in the 21st century dealing with a lot of the same issues that we have been, you know, since 27 years ago and before.
There's also another key character in the book, Khadija. Now, tell us more about how the introduction of this character changes the game for Bastian.
Right, that's a great question. So people love talking about Khadija. Her name is Khadija 3 in the book because she is one of 3 wives, all named Khadija. And she's married. Right?
I know, right?
So I'm sure for her husband it was probably quite an interesting development in his home as well. So Khadija 3 is Bastian's nanny and housekeeper. And for me, she's also one of the really interesting characters because of the kind of relationship that she ends up having with both Bastian, the young Bastian, because she ends up raising Bastian. I mean, the book is set in the 1940s to the 1960s. And so I'm sure a lot of people can imagine what that kind of scenario would have been like. And then also the relationship, which is for me was very, very complex to write, between Bastian's mother, Mama Sanri, and Khadija. You know, because here we have these two women, you know, where the power play is just so unbelievably unequal. And yet they find this familiarity between them that I think catches them both by surprise. You know, one thing, Simpiwe, that I really want to mention about Suitcase of Memory is how one of the overwhelming themes in the book is about the sameness in diversity. Sure. You know, very often it's not something that we spend a lot of time talking about, especially as a nation. You know, our national discourse is largely from points of difference, from the things that we disagree on. We hardly spend a lot of time talking about all the things that make us the same. You know, and spoiler alert, it's a lot of things that make us the same.
Now, Khadija, the story is told in 2 parts.
Yeah, it's A'Eysha.
A'Eysha, beg your pardon.
I know you lost in the books.
This story is so enthralling, and yeah, I'm taken away by the storyline. And the story is told in 2 parts, in sort of the present and the past, and you use the contrast between death and life. So why was it important for you to tell the story in such a way?
For me, one of the nicest things about Bastian is the fact that he's not living his story in the moment, because I think the experience of telling your story while it's happening is very different to when you've gained some distance from it, and when you've had some time to think about it and to reflect upon it. Very much when you're telling your story in the moment, you're overwhelmed by hurt or grief or trauma. You can't really see it very clearly, and so Bastian's dead and he's telling the story from the grave. And so it's at the end of his life is over. He's lived all these incredible moments, and he's able to gain that distance where he's able to really reflect on how things happened, why they happened the way that they did, and to almost make some sense of it, for himself.
Yeah, and this book tells a complex yet deeply layered story of a man with an unclear identity. Just take us through how your writing process was like.
So you mentioned it at the beginning, the book took me 15 years to write, which is a really, really long time to do anything, quite honestly. I mean, 15 years, you could do your entire school career and get a degree in 15 years. So initially when I started writing it, it was because I was struggling with my own identity as well, in terms of being a Muslim woman, in terms of being a Black woman, in terms of being a South African woman. Identity is something that is very multi-layered and multidimensional, and how we interpret that identity, I think, can be complex sometimes as well. And so in terms of the writing process, I tried writing this book so many times and I abandoned it so many times. And I think a lot of readers don't always recognize that the relationship between the writer and their work, is something that is often quite a volatile experience. It's emotional, and then you hate it and you throw it away and you start over again. And, that's very much the nature of the craft. But eventually, I really took it more seriously and I sat down to write it. I was expecting my first child, and I started to think a lot about what legacy means and what does it mean to inherit memory. And as I was thinking about my own childhood memory, these were some of the themes then that I was able to weave into the book.
Yeah, and speak to us about some of the heated conversations this book will spark, especially in those book clubs.
I'm actually really looking forward to having those conversations. I have one lined up. Book clubs, because I think it's such a wonderful conversation starter. You touched on land and classism and history, and those are such loaded themes sometimes, and so I'm really looking forward to talking about that. So some of the reactions to the book have been really, really fascinating for me as well. On the one hand, a lot of people talk about how incredible it is to have a book that's part of essay literature that makes them feel seen. You don't really see me or someone who looks like me, as being an author in South African literature, or you don't really see, characters who have who carry such heavy histories, I think, in a book such as Suitcase of Memory, and especially in terms of neighborhoods. I wrote about characters that are familiar to me, neighborhoods where I grew up in, Bokmakiri and Athlone, and these are all the kinds of places that are represented in the book. And so people say that to them it feels like being seen. It's a homecoming in a different way, and that's something that's really, really special for me. Because I've been looking for representations of myself in South African literature, and it's been incredibly difficult.
Oh, A'Eysha, great chatting to you. Thank you, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insights on this matter. We do appreciate your time. Yeah, and we seem to have lost A'Eysha, but that was journalist and author A'Eysha Kassiem, and she joined us this morning to help us unpack a newly released book titled Suitcase of Memory.